Good evening. Welcome to the fourth Monty Hour. This session is presented by Elwyn Vaughan of Plaid, Cymru and is entitled An Independent Wales. The chair for the session is Denise. If you have any questions regarding the session or want further information about past or future events, please visit the web page montgomery.cloud/hour or email hour@montgomery.cloud.
So thank you very much for coming along to listen. Tonight's talk about independence for Wales, with a particular focus on the potential implications for a border town such as Montgomery. It was originally scheduled to take place in the form of a debate, a full-blown stage debate in Montgomery Town Hall last October. Elwyn and a colleague would have spoken for, and Vaughan Alexander and Oliver Lewis would have put the case against independence. But COVID sadly forced the cancellation of this event. Hopefully later this year, we'll be able to reschedule face-to-face debates, with the idea being that we can exchange ideas, raise awareness, and expand our political and social horizons in a stimulating but well-mannered environment. So why did we pick independence as the topic for our first discussion? Well, it was a subject increasingly referred to in the wake of Brexit and by voices from Scotland. And if we lived in the Machynlleth area or other Welsh heartlands, we might feel that it is the will of an increasing number of people in Wales. Yet it's the topic that I never hear referred to on the streets of Montgomery. And whether we've heard of or care about Owain Glyndŵr or Tryweryn, we do live in Wales. And were there to be a referendum in a few years' time, our votes would count equally. So in the light of everything that happened in the tempestuous last year and what's happening now as the Senedd and Westminster sort of find themselves in a very, very uneasy partnership, if you could call it a partnership, it felt right to initiate a debate and to encourage dialogue and a consideration of what we want the future of Montgomeryshire to be. So in the absence of the three other people, it's fallen on Elwyn tonight to be a one-man show. Many of you will know he is the Plaid Cymru AM candidate and a Powys County Councillor for Glantumyn, which is the area around Cemmaes and Llanbrymire. And he has a difficult job tonight of presenting as balanced a viewpoint as possible on the pros and cons of independence and of referring them to the particular example of us in Montgomery, a Welsh border town which to many appears very English. Questions through the chat mechanism are welcomed and indeed encouraged. Fiendishly difficult questions are not a problem, as it's Elwyn answering them, not me, and indeed will reflect the complexity of what is not for many of us a black and white issue. But I would ask that all questions be put kindly. We're going to give Elwyn about half an hour to talk, and then we'll deal with as many of them as we can. So over to you, Elwyn.
Well, thank you, Denise, for that. So no pressure then, I think. Yes, well, I'll do a presentation first of all, and it is basically the aim is to get people thinking, and it is a current topic, and to challenge our own mindsets in many ways. So here we are. So thank you first of all for the welcome here, and what better place to have this conversation? After all, Montgomery is my favourite place in Montgomeryshire. It's steeped in history and proud of its Welshness. But before I go any further, I'd like to give you a quotation to think about. History tells us that the countries with maximum control of their destinies are best equipped to succeed economically and indeed to secure a greater degree of equity for all their citizens. I'll park that with you to mull over, and I'll come back to it later. In the meanwhile, 754 years ago to this year, on the 29th of September 1267, Wales was acknowledged as a legal entity for the first time, with King Henry III of England signing an agreement with Llywelyn ap Gruffydd at this very location, actually in Rhydchwyma, Montgomery. Though the treaty required Llywelyn to do homage to the King of England for the land, it was in effect an acknowledgement of the power and authority of the Prince of Wales as its own entity. And we have much to learn from history. In the midst of all the hype and scaremongering about Scottish independence, we forget that the British state has been here before. 100 years ago, the War of Independence ended in Ireland with the Anglo-Irish Treaty signed on the 6th of December 1921. The Irish Home Rule movement was a movement that campaigned for self-government, or Home Rule for Ireland within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was a dominant political movement of Irish nationalism from 1870 to the end of World War I. The term Home Rule, first used in the 1860s, meant an Irish legislator with responsibility for domestic affairs. It was variously interpreted from the 1870s and was seen to be part of a federal system for the United Kingdom. A domestic parliament for Ireland, while the imperial parliament at Westminster would continue to have responsibility for imperial affairs. The Home Rule League's goal was limited self-government for Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. In the 1874 general election, League-affiliated candidates won 53 seats in Parliament. In 1880, a radical young Protestant landowner, Charles Stewart Parnell, became chairman. And in the 1880 general election, the League won 63 seats. In 1882, Parnell turned the Home Rule League into the Irish Parliamentary Party, a formally organised party which became to dominate Irish politics, to the exclusion of the previous Liberal, Conservative and Unionist parties that had existed there. In the 1885 general election, the IPP won 85 out of the 103 Irish seats. Despite this success in being a clear voice for Ireland, when the Liberal government of William Ewart Gladstone introduced the first Home Rule Bill in 1886, the bill was defeated in the House of Commons after split in the Liberal Party. They allied with Lord Salisbury's Conservatives until 1914. Alas, some things never change. A second Home Rule Bill in 1893 was defeated in the House of Lords. A third Home Rule Bill was introduced in 1912, leading to the Home Rule crisis. Following the Easter Rising of 1916, particularly the arrests and executions that followed, public support shifted from the Home Rule movement to the more radical Sinn Féin party. In November 1918, Sinn Féin secured a majority of 73 Irish seats in the general election, with 25 of these taken uncontested. The IPP was decimated, falling to only 6 seats, and it disbanded soon afterwards. In January 1919, 27 Sinn Féin MPs assembled in Dublin and proclaimed themselves unilaterally as an independent parliament for an Irish Republic. This was again ignored by Britain, and the Irish War of Independence ensued. The important lesson here is, despite the vast majority of Irish MPs being from the Irish Parliamentary Party, the intransigence of the British state forced the people of Ireland from a Home Rule movement wanting federalism to much harder line Sinn Féin and full-blown independence. A century later, and in 2010, the SNP had only 6 MPs at Westminster. Today, they have 47, with opinion polls showing them again to gain all bar 1 seat at the next election, whilst also having a clear majority in the May Scottish elections. And despite the emphasis by the Unionist establishment that the 2014 referendum vote was lost, it's worth reminding ourselves that 45% actually voted for independence. And who can remember that much publicised vow that was made in the final days by David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, only for it to be forgotten afterwards? As in Ireland a century earlier, the feeling of arrogance by the London establishment, of broken promises and contempt, has only hardened people's feeling of disillusionment. That, combined with the different priorities regarding Europe, has created a different path for Scotland's future. Yet, we see Boris making the same exact mistakes as happened in Ireland, resulting in only pushing the Scottish people further and further away. It's a very brave person who thinks that Scotland won't be independent of the British state in the near future. The challenges in these isles are the same as have been for centuries. a dominant centralist power-mad state based in the southeast of England versus all those on the fringe. Armes Prydain, the prophecy of Britain, is a prophetic 10th century poem in Welsh from the Book of Taliesin, which relates to complex political strifes amongst all of the peoples of Britain. In a rousing style characteristic of Welsh heroic poetry, it describes a future where all the Brythonic peoples are allied with the Scots, the Irish and the Vikings of Dublin under Welsh leadership, and together succeed in driving the Anglo-Saxons from Britain. The poem is commonly described as an expression of Welsh frustration with the pragmatic, peaceful policies of Hywel Dda towards the then ascendant Kingdom of Wessex. Little did that poet think we'd be discussing the same issues 1,000 years later. And if Scotland becomes independent, what then for Wales? Do we become a mere region of England, a Western England province? The reality is Wales has been an internal colony. From coal, slate, iron, and now energy and water, all fueling the wealth of the city and the centralist state. Wales was the first industrialized nation in the world. The coal and manufacturing industries were the heart of many communities. Yet what we often hear by the establishment is Wales is a poor nation. It can't afford to run its own affairs. In a continual circle, we see Westminster extract wealth from Wales or derives it of investment, which makes Wales poorer by lack of investment and extraction of wealth, thus seemingly justifying their claim that Wales is poor. The reality is that the mid-Wales annual salary is £9,000 a year less than the UK average. The number of self-employed here is much higher, with 27% in Powys and Ceredigion. Far too often, it's a matter of must and need due to lack of opportunities rather than for greater wealth. Yet the high cost of houses is ridiculous, needing 7.5 times earnings to afford the average purchase cost of a house. So imagine the reaction when you realise there are 14,000 holiday homes in Mid and West Wales. They symbolise those with means, the haves as compared to have-nots, whilst our young people can't afford to live in their communities. Yet, whilst this poverty exists in our communities, the very economic assets we have work against us. Nothing crystallises this more than the symbolic nature of Tryweryn, Lake Vyrnwy, Clywedog, Elwyn, etc. And how many realise that Conservative Prime Minister Mrs Thatcher, when privatising the water industry, ensured the Severn Trent had a 99-year lease, which guarantees them 360 million litres daily for threepence a tonne. A pittance. This is reflected further in the fact that since 2006, wealth in the southeast of England, despite all the talk about austerity, has grown 31%, yet only 4% in Wales. And a classic example of this is the HS2 investment, that 100 billion monolith, which cost Wales 5 billion capital investment and the Welsh economy 150 million a year, according to KPMG. The further centralisation of power with the Internal Market Bill, the transfer of control of the post-EU funds as the Prosperity Fund to London, and the contempt by the current Conservative Party towards Wales merely shows their true attitude towards us. The lowering of number of MPs from Wales from 40 to 32, lone voices in a sea of English MPs, will further exasperate matters. As former Conservative MP Gitta Bebb and former Conservative Chair Chris Patten have said, the Conservative Party has become the English Nationalist Party. What therefore are the options? What this shows is the need for parity of power, for mutual respect, for social justice and fairness. Some highlight a federation. In a federation, sovereignty is shared between central and constituent national or state governments. Each level has clearly articulated functions, with some powers pooled between them, but none has absolute authority over the others. But questions remain, however, how England, with approximately 85% of the total population, could be integrated successfully into federation without causing disputes. However, this has been talked about since the 1870s. And with Ireland and Scotland having left the table, it's very much after the horse has bolted approach, or as we'd say in Welsh, codi pais ar ôl. Confederalism. A confederation is a union of sovereign member nations that for reasons of efficiency and common security have assigned a limited portfolio of functions and powers to a central body. Confederations are usually established by treaty, in contrast to a federal constitution addressing crucially shared interests such as internal trade, currencies, defence and foreign relations. National parliaments, not individuals, are formally represented in central institutions, with people first relating to the member nation and next to the confederation. For this to work, Wales would need parity of power with the other member nations, and Scotland and potentially Ireland would have to join. And of course, England would have to change. Then there's independence. The first thing to be clear is that Wales on independence has no legal liability for the UK debt. That remains with the successor state, the UK. The UK has conceded that. In a Treasury statement prior to the 2014 Scottish referendum, it pledged that the UK, as the continuing government, would in all circumstances honour the contractual terms of debt issued by the UK government. The financial data relating to Wales' deficit is collected and issued by the UK government. It is conceded that the data contains estimates, assumptions and adjustments. The deficit is currently regarded as being 13.7 billion. However, as this figure includes 1.7 billion of capital expenditure, the fiscal deficit is actually 12 billion. Also included are other items that would not be attributed to an independent Wales. These include expenditure not directly spent in Wales, but which the UK government says Wales must pay to UK-wide spending. Items such as contribution to debt, well, we've dealt with that previously. Defence, board agency costs, and more. They are areas where Wales had no say in terms of amount or relevance. The cost of this expenditure is 5.4 billion. This is the UK giving Wales the money to give back to the UK to spend on things outside Wales, but counting as Wales' deficit. I'm sure it makes sense somewhere. Then there's 1.3 billion of EU transactions. Having left the EU, it's obviously no longer counted. There are also policy areas that Wales government has no control over, but which has significant effect on Wales' economy. There is a net pensioner migration to Wales of approximately 3,000 per year. The cost of the Wales economy has been estimated by the Institute of Welsh Affairs as 2 billion. These costs would be borne by the originator country in the same way as retiring to Spain and other European countries. If we remove these costs of 8.7 billion, therefore, the deficit is reduced to actually 3.3 billion. The closing of taxation loopholes prevalent in the UK system would further benefit Wales' economy. A Cardiff University study with the Wales government reported that the raising of Wales revenues of income tax and national insurance to the UK average level would raise a further 5.4 billion. Anomalies, like we've seen with the 7 crossings, tolls have been collected on the Welsh side of the crossings on Welsh soil. However, the revenues, VAT, etc., have been claimed by the UK Treasury. Wales has a positive balance of trade. Wales government figures show that the value of sales by businesses in Wales is estimated at 101 billion. A balance of trade surplus of 34.1 billion. However, taking account of the sales and purchases within Wales, the actual export surplus is reduced to 5 billion. Nevertheless, still a surplus. Wales in 2016 was the 5th largest exporter of electricity in the world and produces surplus electricity to the value of 1.5 billion. Imagine a Wales free to encourage, invest and reap the benefits of energy projects in solar, wind power and the development of marine and tidal energy and hydroelectric, rather than multinational corporations or Crown Estate, as we only saw yesterday, and the Treasury. It is estimated the value of future energy presently being investigated to be 4 billion, although this almost certainly is an underestimate. Water too is a valuable resource. It is now being traded for the first time as a commodity on Wall Street. Estimates of the value if Wales charged for its water range from 600 millions to 2 billions per year. Even at a lower estimate, it's a significant annual income. And some food for thought. Only a few weeks ago, the Tories in Westminster were excited to sign a trade deal with Albania. Albania has a population of 2.8 million. Wales has 3.1. It has a GDP of 15.2 billion. Wales has 75 billion GDP. And they have a GDP per capita of 10,186, whilst in Wales it's 23,860. Yet they say Wales is too small and too poor. In the 1960s, the Welsh GDP was twice that of Ireland's. Now, as an independent nation in the 21st century, the economy of the Irish Republic is 4 times the size of Wales. If Wales, with a claimed gross deficit of 13 billion, which is 17% of GDP, can't be independent, how can the UK, with a forecast deficit of 350 billion, which is 19% of GDP, manage to be? The reality is the jingoistic ultra-right agenda surrounding Brexit is the death throes of the empire. And in many ways, what we're seeing is a crisis of identity for England. And going back to that initial quote I gave you, history tells us that the countries with maximum control of their destinies are best equipped to succeed economically, and indeed to secure a greater degree of equity for all their citizens. As said by Michael Gove, no less, in the House of Commons, the 27th of February, 2020. Surely, if that's true for his vision of Little England, it's also true for all the Celtic countries. Empires grow, but empires also wither and die. The question is what type of Wales we want as that relic of the past fades away. Perhaps it's a time for England to have its independence and find itself, thus helping everyone else. Let the spirit of Rhyd Chwima free again. Let's have parity of power, justice and fairness, mutual respect, and let our communities blossom in a green, sustainable Wales. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Elwyn. I'm going to start with a question from Oliver. Right, and this is where we'd ask for a little bit of the opposing view, as I know how strongly you feel in favour of independence. But we sit in Montgomery, where many people here send their children to school in England, where many of us go to hospital in England, where many of us work in England, where many of us are. I say many of us, you know, I'm Welsh born and bred, but many people who've moved here are English. So Oliver's question, is the present border appropriate for Wales to exist as a functional sovereign state, given the integration of Wales with England in a way that does not apply in the same way between England and Scotland?
There, I think it's obviously a hugely porous border. I think everybody with any sense has to acknowledge that. Having said that, you know, even the Scottish border and even Ireland with the UK actually has very strong relationships on all sorts of levels. In an ideal world, I would say, and if you, the model within Europe should be the norm within these isles. It doesn't matter which country you live in, people should still be able to cross borders, do those daily commutes, or go to purchase services from either side of the border, because it works both ways, as need be. It depends how you want to define independence. Some look at independence as see this word independence as building brick walls. I see it more as building bridges, to be honest, and that's a totally different outlook. But I know what Oliver's trying to say. I think it'd be more of an issue for England than it would for Wales, to be honest, because I think we obviously, whatever this construct in future, would have to have a positive working relationship on a day-to-day level with the real people, real families, and real communities. And if people are mature about that, there shouldn't be a problem. It's managed within Europe, the rest of Europe. I do think it's much more of a Brexiteer attitude problem than it would be for the likes of me.
And there's a question from Jill. Despite warm words, the last 20 years have seen a steady erosion of local powers and democracy and an urban-centric approach. So would full devolution reverse this decline in local accountability and decision-making, or simply allow even greater centralisation of power to Cardiff? I mean, I'm with Jill on this one. We moan when I ask why things don't happen in Powys, people will say it's because of the funding settlement to Powys, and those decisions on that funding settlement are made in Cardiff. So why would independence benefit Powys? Because our focus here is not on Cardiff, it's on good old Montgomery and farming folk.
Yeah. A couple of things there. I think, obviously, I'm not here to protect the Labour government. But when people tell me nothing happens in Powys or Montgomeryshire in terms of the Welsh government, I often ask, why do people say that, and whose agenda does that support? I hear Tories very often in Montgomeryshire saying that, okay? But let me remind you, the Powys settlement this coming financial year is amongst the best in Wales, okay? Powys Council have a substantially more funding than they anticipated. Let's not forget, Welsh Government have paid 7 million for the dialysis unit in Welshpool. Let's not forget they're paying for 2 new schools in Welshpool. Let's not forget they're paying over 100 million for the Newtown bypass. Let's not forget they paid a substantial grant for control techniques. Let's not forget they paid for substantial investments in some of the factories in Buttington. I think it's far too easy to blame Cardiff, and there is a need at times, but I'm dubious whose agenda that is. Okay. Now, as to the democracy issue, I fully agree with Jill's point. There's no point having devolution of power if it stops just at the M4. That's not what it should be about. It should be about empowering people. To me, independence is about much more than a slogan. It's about independence of mind. It's enabling people to do things. It's a can-do attitude. And that means at grassroots. As a Powys councillor, if there's one thing I'm well aware of, is the need for transparency and openness at a local level. That is has been a weakness, and many would argue is still a weakness far too often.
A question from me. I don't really speak about Welsh independence to many people, but I've said to you, and I'll say it to everyone here, that if I was asked to vote tomorrow, I would vote against it. I might think differently in a few years' time, but I also voted against Brexit, as in my heart of hearts, I'd like to think that we're stronger together than apart. So my question is, how can we hope to encourage people to engage with the future of the Welsh nation in areas like Montgomery, where proximity to and hence dependence on England can seem far more significant? In other words, Montgomery is a different place to Machynlleth.
Yes, but if you're even in Machynlleth, you go to Cat, and there's not many people from Machynlleth there. Okay. And the reality is they have international networks at all sorts of levels. So that's not such a it doesn't matter which part of Montgomeryshire or Mid Wales you live in. I really don't see the problem as building what. If people think of it, as I said before, about building walls, that's a negative way of thinking. I count myself as a European, okay? If I had my way, we would still be in Europe because we have a family of nations, and that is what should happen. And we've got much more in common in Wales, and very often in different parts of Europe, than actually we have in southeast of England. There's not, and I'm not just talking about the Basque Country or Flanders, but rural parts of Spain. Same challenges. We often have depopulation of people migrating. You can go to villages in Aragon and they're totally desolate because the shift to the urban centres. Well, those are the same sort of challenges we face in mid Wales very often, since the days of DBRW actually. So it's putting us in common and in mainstream in terms of policies and approaches, as in many other countries and regions. It doesn't matter where they are. We don't have to be fixated just at looking at England for everything.
Mm. So before I see if there's any more questions from anyone else, do you have anything positive to say for us remaining sort of against independence, so to speak?
Oh, yeah. Let me be perfectly honest here. I think I've told you before, I'm not, there's many people who feel much stronger about independence than me. I think it is a journey, and I think people need to be honest. These things are not going to happen overnight. And I think what I'm trying to do is put a historical context in terms of Ireland and Scotland, and the question of what the future of Wales is for the future, in what direction we're going. That's where I'm coming from. And there are things that sooner or later we will have to face up to, whatever construct that may be.
So, okay, I'm going to look through the questions we've had so far. And can I just check, if we run out of time to go through them, do we have a mechanism for you sort of providing answers post the meeting?
Yes,
we can feed back to people.
Yes,
fantastic. So I'm just going to pick on the ones that catch my eye, but anyone rest assured that Elwyn will give a little bit of time sort of and give some feedback after the meeting. So Michael has asked, what might the defence policy of an independent Wales look like? Thank you, Michael.
Well, as a person who's not pro-militarism, I'd have minimum effect. In reality, like many nations in the world, we don't all have to be militaristic and think that we want to rule the world. And it's a different starting point, a different perspective on the world. That's what I would say.
And Gwyl has asked, should Powys, as a historic sovereign entity, be allowed to vote to move from Wales to England should a vote for Welsh independence succeed? This would appear to be only fair if Wales is allowed to vote to leave the UK.
Well, I think we'd be bogged down for another century defining the boundaries of Powys, I think. Yeah. Do we you'd have the old split, or do we have Powys Vadog, which is up to Wrexham way in it, or not? And do we include Shrewsbury in it? That's the question. That's the perhaps we should turn the question the other way. Do we take Penguin back with Shrewsbury? Yeah.
Right. And Alison Alexander has said, Elwyn, you talk of Westminster's arrogance pushing other nations towards independence. Isn't the answer to this not to change the formal structure of our nations with all the associated upheaval, but to change the party in power in Westminster?
In an ideal world, very often, but yeah, I think in reality, I think there's a good question there. It's a question about the future of Labour Party in England, actually, because in reality, as we lose seats now, if we go down 40 to 32 in Wales, whatever happens in Scotland, they're going to lose seats there. The overall shift of seats once they come in for the next general election, will be towards the southeast of England, basically to Tory territory, which makes it much more difficult for any Labour government in the future on a UK level to gain power. So I think that is a real challenge for them. And I'm glad it's their problem and not mine.
I'm not sure who's asked this question, but it's, why do you think Scotland are more behind independence than Wales? And did you think it will happen? Well, do you think it will happen? I imagine that's Scottish independence.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. We've got to accept that Scotland had many more institutions that were independent anyway. They had a legal system, they had very much a banking system. You know, those are important institutions within any country. And also geographically simplistic further away. And I think, who was it, Oliver said about cross-border connections things. We have a much porous border here. So those all factors over time make a huge difference to people's perspective and outlook. But I do think, you know, as I was trying to make the point about empires. Empires, you know, do wither and die. That is the nature of the beast. And I think in reality, Scotland has been pushed further and further away. And yeah, I think it is only a matter of time. I think it might not happen in the next 2 years, but I can't say, you know, I can't see us sitting here in 10 or 15 years with Scotland and Northern Ireland still being in the same format as we are now. You know, in Northern Ireland, it's a generational thing. There's more Catholics than Protestants for the first time ever. Brexit has further eroded trust between the Protestant community and Boris and his gang. And I think, I just can't see why it won't happen.
Do you think that what sort of happened in the last year with COVID and the pushback from some of the larger cities, like, you know, the mayor of Manchester and whatever, and you know, the pushback from regions in England, do you think that might encourage the Conservative government to treat Wales kinder because it's having to take more notice of areas of England outside of the southeast? Do you think that sort of shows a change of softening of heart?
I think the opposite. What we've seen, interestingly, and I've deliberately, what we've seen is reality is the total opposite. If you look at the Conservative Party in Wales, the old Conservative Party of David Melding and pro-devolution, pro-Wales, etc., has gone. You know, if you just look at the list of candidates they have, it's no coincidence that people like Susie Davis have been chucked out, basically. That's the manoeuvrings. She's been sidelined. David Melding's going. You list the list of candidates in South Wales Central. You have candidates there openly saying they want to get rid of Welsh, the Senedd. Well, you know, what they're trying to do is go for that UKIP, BREXIT type of vote. And when you see then things like the post-European funds being centralised in Europe, in London, when you see the internal market bill, all the noises you're getting, and actually what is happening is further centralisation, which the point I was trying to make is totally the wrong approach. It failed in Ireland 100 years ago. It's failed in Scotland. And it doesn't help matters in Wales. Not if you really want to create a balanced and a feeling of unity. I think it's totally wrong path to go.
Ben Poole has asked, what would be the process of a financial split from the rest of the UK, including Welsh currency and trade financial discussions with Europe?
A split from the rest of the UK. Yeah, okay, good question. Well, if you look, the only thing we can do is look at what's happening in Scotland, isn't it? You know, in reality is these things take much longer. And as I mentioned, the reality in Wales is there's heck a lot of work that needs to be done by those advocating independence on these very issues, because in terms of the economy, in terms of those figures I presented to you earlier, in terms of the financial discussions, etc. And also the wider conversation, what happens then in the relationship to Europe, because would we be in, would we be out? That is a conversation in itself. That's not something somebody could resolve today.
Gwyl, going forward with that, has said the failure of the EU to have a mechanism to leave a constituent nation and become independent at a 66% vote in favour has not helped us all have a sensible mechanism to change governance. Do you have any comments on the failure of the EU to have a mechanism for a nation leaving?
Shall I clarify?
Yes, possibly, yes.
Yeah, what I'm meaning is that, we look at people still in the EU, and if there was a mechanism whereby, say, Catalonia could vote at a higher percentage than 50%, because to a certain extent you don't want people flicking in and out, but it could be, not far above 50%, so that they could leave Spain and join the EU as an independent nation. In other words, that you have mechanisms in place, particularly at an EU level, where countries can move around, and that would also have to be agreed by the nations of Europe.
I think that makes sense. One of the obvious things happened in Catalonia. Not only did we see the Spanish state at its worst, but we also huge disappointment by many in the response by European institutions. But at the end of the day, what you have is the problem. You have the nation states within Europe, and historically, Plaid. I remember going back to the 1980s. Plaid were very much in the forefront there, talking about Europe of the regions, and that's where we should be, and that would be in tandem with the exact point you just made. But unfortunately, it's still made up of a construct of nation states, and that was very much an irony in terms of the whole Brexit debate also, in a sense. A lot of the powers already existed in those nation states. But yeah, I think the way Catalonia has been treated is a disgrace for all, and let's not forget that there are people who democratically elected still in prison in Madrid. And Puigdemont is still in exile from his country. And if that happened in Asia or in Latin America, many European politicians would be at the forefront of protests and things condemning such action.
Anne McGarry has commented or asked, would we have the hugely innovative Swansea tidal lagoon largely built by now if the decision had been made in Wales rather than in London?
Well, I think definitely we would have, because the Welsh Senedd, as it is now, actually offered a multi-million-pound package to make it happen. So, that there were a number of things. HS2 I mentioned, Swansea Lagoon's another one. The electrification of the railway line further than Cardiff is another thing. Those are key decisions in recent years, which should have been taken on a Welsh level, basically, and be seen as tools to strengthen the economy of Wales, and seen as a positive light rather than seen as a negative light.
Mavanwi has said, isn't it true the EU has consistently declared they will never admit what they called irredentist states? And I am informed, we're all informed, by Keys that an irredentist state is a state with claims on other states' territories. I'm not quite sure how that applies in this context. Do you understand, Elwyn?
Well, I know, I can guess what Mavan is going after. It's a whole question, going back to Catalonia, basically. Would they allow that? I think it's been brought up recently, but in Scotland, would it be allowed in, sort of things? And that's always a big argument. But however, if you look at Eastern European states, they were allowed in. And if you look at the Czech Republic, which split, of course, after the revolution there, into become two states. All those are into Europe European Union at the moment. But I think the
have said, Elwyn, or
yeah.
Spain have said they'll leave the EU if any breakaway states are admitted, and that's the problem. No, they've never said that about the Czech. They didn't say that about the Czech Republic, which is, you know.
Yeah. I think there's a huge. I can't see them turning down Scotland, to be honest with you. I think they would like Scotland back in, if nothing else, as a way of raising two fingers at London and put salt in the wound. That's my thought on it.
We've got a couple of questions on sort of tourism and the general quality of life in Wales. So from Phil and Elizabeth, well, they've asked two questions. First of all, how would you fund a health service, the maintenance of roads, etc., if we became a member of the disunited kingdom? And secondly, our main industry would seem to be tourism. How do you think the English would react?
Well, on the funding side, like any organisation, you have to balance the books. Basically, you have income and expenditure, and you allocate it for different budgets. What I tried to highlight before was the claim of the deficit of being something like 13 billion is not what all it seems on face value. And that's where further analysis and needs to be taken to further proof those figures. So that's no different to any other state. And, you know, let's remember, since the Second World War, 50 other countries have left what was the glorious empire, and then not one of them has made an application to rejoin it. And I think it's also, remember, people keep saying Wales can't do this and the other. And I'm not talking as somebody who's a hardline person, independence pro, but I want people to challenge their own minds. If places like Malta, right, can sustain themselves and be independent and run their own affairs, in reality, are you really saying Wales can't? And I think people need to be honest with themselves. You know, they've been indoctrinated over the years by the state, and everything is British and things. But in reality, does it have to be that way? Then the tourism side, tourism. I would argue tourism is not the biggest industry in the reality. It's one. It is a key sector. Question is, I don't see people stopping. Well, when COVID's not on, I don't see people stopping going to Spain or Portugal or Malta or Cyprus or a whole host of other countries because they're independent. Why would they stop coming to Wales?
The other countries have the sun. Just well. But anyhow, but link to that tourism question. It sort of takes us in. I was going to say it takes us into the area of the relationship, or sometimes the hard-nosed stuff that sort of upsets me on social media, of anti-English feeling or anti-Welsh feeling, more the people side of things. So Andy's made the point about, how would you stop people moving to Wales because they perceive the quality of life to be better? Well, you might not want to stop them moving to Wales. You might want to increase our population and make us more viable as an independent state. But, Phil and Liz have said, how do you think the English would react to Wales becoming an independent state? And said the thing that upsets me is independence sometimes gets linked to what it is to be Welsh, and that's where I find it gets quite, yeah.
That's a fair point, and let's be honest. You get people saying daft things on both sides of every argument, do you?
So do you think that if Wales became independent, it would have any impact at all on how attractive we were as a holiday destination or a place to work
Why would it? It doesn't change, does it? People are not going to go to stop going to Scotland. Do people stop going to Ireland because it's independent? No. So I think it's a non-question. I can't see the logic why people would stop. it's like saying they don't go to other countries because they're independent.
I think I don't know
by voice.
Sorry, Andy.
Can I
Andy,
ask
do you
it
want?
by voice?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question out. It isn't about whether people visit us on a tourism basis or whether they visit us for whatever reason. You know, people will always cross this border, always have done throughout history for good and bad reasons. The actual reality is you live in a very low density population area, and it's highly attractive because its economic value in terms of property compared to, say, the south of England, etc., is going to make it more and more attractive. You therefore have an influx of people, many of which will be educated in England and consider themselves partially English. I had a chap round here just this week who said it's strange how the Welsh and the Scots, and he's as English as they come, white knight. So, and he said, I actually like living here because people actually, it doesn't matter whether they're English or Welsh, they just feel it. So, and obviously I'm not native Welsh born here, but you can all trace your ancestry and you can all trace it through history. And I think what annoys people is that there's a level of education, especially when you're on the internet, which I spoke to you about before, where people get very, very almost racist about in their replies. And okay, that's attractive to pro-Welsh websites, but there's a point at which you go, hang on a minute, you know, you need to be a little bit more knowledgeable about where English, you know, English is a relatively new thing in the terms of our history, wherever you live in this land. So, you know, you can say the same about Welsh. You've already alluded to the Irish and the Scots. It's this north-south. You've alluded to the Senedd. You've alluded to South Wales and the way that politics works there. They're the battles that have always existed. So actually, you know, Montgomery by its history has always been inclusive. It's the way the architecture is designed here. They've always battled over the same thing, and that's the River Severn. It doesn't matter whether you want to go to all your Welsh heroes or your English heroes. They weren't heroes then. They battled over the same things, you know. And in recent history, the things that we fight for are the same things they fought for, the stuff that's in the ground and the stuff that's growing on the land. And if you get an influx of people, COVID being the obvious, you know, we've had more visitors here than it could possibly have in another year. They just haven't been in the shops because they're not allowed to. But they've been walking around the town because they feel the need to escapism. Where do you go with that at the current situation where people feel change? You know, I can relate to English as much as I can relate to ancestral Welsh, but it's all about patience and things don't change. The thing with the Senedd and Paris, absolute pain in the arse in terms of economics, but it doesn't stop people wanting to come here. What do you do about it?
People will always move on cross borders, won't they? That's, as he said, you know, it's happened over history. In terms of then people wanting to live here, whatever, it comes down to things such as planning policies and things as we have now. Now, you know, there are many aspects which some of us would be critical of planning policies or things to do with holiday homes or whatever at the moment. And, you know, rightly so, those are social issues. And as in every places, as in Cornwall, big issue down there at the moment, you try and develop relevant planning policies to respond to the needs of your communities. And that's what you're there to serve at the end of the day, isn't it?
Elwyn, do you think there's anything that the Welsh government can learn from Westminster?
I'm sure there are many.
Any way where, any areas where you think things are done better because they're done through Westminster than they are done through, you know, they would be done through the Welsh government. You know, what are the actual arguments for staying connected to England?
Well, there are obvious issues, I think, which are you have to continue to work and actually do more than likely at a wider level. You know, there are environmental issues at the moment that transcend not just the UK but a wider Europe and the world. And we have to develop policies and take action on a basis of these islands as a whole, I would say. That is one obvious thing. I'm not so fussed about somebody mentioned the military side of things before. I'm not so fussed about that side of things, but there are things like that and climate change issues where it makes sense to pool resources and make the most of people's skills at a wider level. I'm not here to preach parochialism. Let me be clear about that.
Okay, someone's commented, the voting system ensures we have little choice between Tory and Labour. What plans do Plaid have to try and change people's minds? I'm not quite sure what the next, of the Welsh video tease. I see the Yes campaign for independence gathering pace. Oh, okay. I see the Yes campaign for independence gathering pace, but a lot of people don't want to get behind Plaid. Why do you think this is? I don't know if the person who is iPhone, do you actually want to ask this question yourself? Or are you happy just to leave it like this?
Well, first of all, I would say Yes Cymru, I'll respond to you. Yes Cymru has grown tremendously in the last 12 months. We've seen from a base of, 2,000 up to something like 17,000, which is a huge growth in the last 12 months. Likewise, I could say this, Yes Scotland. Yes Scotland as a movement is much wider than the SNP. So people should be don't assume because they are members of one organization, they automatically fall to be part of a political party in the traditional sense. That's the main thing. How people vote for a whole host of different reasons, not just because they are members of Yes Cymru. It depends which constituencies they are, who they think they can most likely to win, etc., etc. So, right. Oh, I know who's asked the question now. Sorry. Yeah, I can see the chat box. So that's the reality. It's far too simplistic to say because they have one box, they automatically move to one political party. It's like saying on environmental issues, if people think environmental issues are key important for them, or being members of Greenpeace, or they should automatically be supporting the Green Party, for instance. Well, I'm sure the Green Party would like that to happen, but that's not how it does happen, unfortunately.
I don't think I've read this question out, but if I have, apologies. Vaughan was asked, should a pro-independence movement contain the right and centre as well as the left?
Well, I think if you're talking in terms of European countries again, if you look at places like Catalonia, the reality is you have a range of political parties there, right across the political spectrum, but they are Catalan parties. And that's what's interesting. That's the difference between there and here. And that shows the maturity of their politics. Here we tend to have political parties which are British parties with just a Welsh label on them. But there they are, and the Basque country also, you have hard left parties in the Basque country, which are, but also you will have a centre-right party. And I think that is healthy as part of any democracy, but I think that will happen over time as Welsh politics matures, and I think as perhaps what are now British parties become more Welsh-based institutions as they evolve over time.
David Lear has asked, should the independence movement be focused more on democratic reasoning and based on civic nationalism rather than ethno-nationalism and historical reasons?
Yes, I would agree with that. Any national movement has to be based on a modern context. I was referring to myself to historical perspectives tonight, just to give an added dimension and context, basically. But yeah, there's a danger for national movements just to be based on romanticization and things. At the end of the day, people want to know what type of vision you have for Wales in this context. what type of values you have, what your priorities are. Those are the key things. And yes, rightly, I agree with the person.
And Alison, I don't know if you're there and you wish to put your point directly, the one that begins on the notion of countries in charge of their own destinies. Do you want to put that question yourself, Alison, if you're there?
Yes, hello there. Hi, good evening. Hiya. Hello, Elwyn. Hi.
Hiya.
I was picking up on your notion of the idea of countries in charge of their own destinies being more likely, more able to thrive economically. When we think of countries like Spain and Portugal and how the standard of living for people there and the general prosperity of the nation increased after joining the EU. Wouldn't you agree that cooperation, freedom of movement, standardization, harmonization of standards makes trade easier, the opportunities for prosperity are greater, and that independence is the flip side of that, more red tape, less opportunity for young people to go and learn skills elsewhere and bring them back to Wales. So picking up on your first notion.
I would totally agree with you on bulk of what you've said there, but you're coming from the perspective of independence as being this British Brexiteer type model, rather than what I would count as a vision of what we should be. That is why some of us have argued for being part of Erasmus, for instance. That is why I used to do a lot with European projects and things, and the whole purpose of European regional funding, of course, was to make up the disparity within nation states. And the reason West Wales and South Wales valleys gained so much of that from the European Union was to make up of historical weaknesses and get a better balance within regions, within these islands, and within Europe as a whole. So yeah, I'm fully aware, and I know how Ireland in particular, which is a bit closer to us than Portugal, how they benefited tremendously, did a quantum leap in terms of IT and technology and things, using European resources over a number of years, but also what's important there in attracting American investment. Now I would argue that there's no reason why you can't have both.
Is there I think I've come to the end of the questions that sit on my chat. Apologies if I've missed any out. Is there anyone who wants to ask one last question from the perspective of being not in favour of independence at the moment? Just to make sure everyone's had a fair crack of the whip. Right, it looks like you're safe, Elwyn.
Wait a minute. I think we have that one.
Oh, right. Excellent.
We've lived in lovely Montgomery for 7.5 years. We were here 25 years ago when we first got married, and we were in the drama group. So we like Montgomery, and we've lived in North Wales, Penrhyn Bay for 10 years. Now, if Wales goes for independence, there's 3.5 million people approximately. Are you going to tax everybody to the hilt till we squeak to pay for all this? And also, we've got the same population of Slovenia. Now, we went on holiday to Slovenia. It was very poor. People did not have a very high standard of living, and everything, the prices had gone up 75% since they joined the EU, and they were siphoning money off the EU to fund massive road projects, like the same as Madeira did. Now, and we were paying for all that, and the roads around Montgomery are falling to pieces, especially when you go from here to Shrewsbury. I've just had my front suspension repaired for the second time in 4 years with the road degradation of the road.
Cost of 500 not paid.
I've just paid £550 to have my car repaired because of the condition of the road going to Martin. How are you going to, if we get independence, the only way you're going to get it is if we get Labour out of the Senate. Then we get rid of the Senate and have our own government, and then we would sell up and move if you got independence. Because I don't see how you can fund it.
I can't see it working at
Well,
all.
a couple of things there. First of all, Wales is no different to other countries throughout the world, and if other countries can do it, so can Wales. The point I was trying to make initially when I gave figures is to show you that the actual it can be sustainable if you take into consideration those factors I presented right in the beginning. I'm not, at this moment in time, I'm not saying that everything is hunky-dory, and there's further work that needs to be done on that. But to say Wales can't do it and yet other places can is a fallacy. The only thing I would say is it sounds to me as if the roads to Shrewsbury are worse once you cross into the Shropshire border. So that perhaps raises a question about, can England afford to sustain their own services?
But we are sponsored by the British government to a high.
Where do you think our taxes as people of Wales now go to? Where do you think our VAT and national insurance go to? It goes to Westminster. It's not as if this magic, everything's dependent on London for everything. Things like central banks and everything else, they're just institutions of the state. If you're creating a state, all those institutions are part of it.
Well, I don't think you'll persuade us.
You won't persuade us for independence.
So I'll be off to Shrewsbury.
We'll be off to.
Please don't go, Liz, Phil. Please don't go. I'd miss you dreadfully.
I say, watch the potholes on the road.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who'd like to further challenge Elwyn?
We would move if we got independence.
Well,
the road to Shrewsbury has always been dangerous. Whichever
political party's been in charge. Right.
Absolutely.
So
depends on your horse.
Yeah. Elwyn, do you have any last words?
Well, all I would say we can banter and things here tonight. I think it's important to discuss these things, or whatever nature the structures of these islands take. We need to realize that we need democracy closer to the people in whatever format that takes, and further decentralization of power. And that in itself would be actually a unifying force within these islands, rather than being seen as something negative and splitting and dividing people.
Right. Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Elwyn, for your time in preparing for this, and for the time you've given tonight, and for facing a sea of comments. I'm sure that Elwyn and the rest of us will go through all the comments after this meeting, and I don't know if Gwyl would like to talk about how any feedback might be given, or any write-up of this meeting.
Yes. Well, I'd like to thank you, Denise, as well, for hosting and comparing tonight. Basically, obviously, we do record the chat, and we could probably send that through to Elwyn so he can pick up on anything. But if you go to the web page, then we do have an email address, and anything you send through to us, we can pass on to Elwyn. And since we're closing down, just to mention, next week we've got Gardening for Wildlife, and I don't know whether Jeremy wants to say a few things about that.
I don't say very much. No, it's Dan Hodgkiss from Montgomery Wildlife Trust talking about gardening for wildlife, so encouraging wildlife into your own gardens. So you're all very welcome to join us for that session.
Elwyn, do you want to have the last word before we close down?
Thank you very much. I think it's good that you're organising these series of events. Wish you well for the next coming weeks.
Thank you, Elwyn. Diolch.
Diolch, Elwyn. Nos stop, pawb. Good night.
Nostar.
Nostar.
That Sharon Cymru.
Nostar, Phil and Liz, love you loads. Good night.
Bye, everyone.